Jim Trusty was Donald Trump's lawyer for a year. He was meant to represent Trump in Jack Smith's investigation into Trump's handling of classified documents, but withdrew without explanation a day after Trump was indicted. He was also meant to represent Trump in his defamation lawsuit against CNN, but withdrew last year due to apparently irreconcilable differences between him and Trump. He joins me now. Jim Trusty, welcome to the program.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you.
You too. Let's start by assuming that Mr. Trump is the next president. What, if any, legal cases would remain a threat to him?
Well, really, all of them have some measure of threat to them. I mean, it's really uncharted territory. So nobody can get on your show and pretend that they have any solid predictions here. But I think there's a lot of room for mischief before the end of the year. In other words, post-election, but before his swearing in. You could see the January 6th case, for instance, proceed to a long series of hearings on the immunity issue. You could also see, presidential immunity from being indicted. You could also see some mischief there in terms of whether the Judge Chutkan made a decision on the appointments clause issue, which was essentially a constitutional claim that was successful in Florida on the Mar-a-Lago case, that the president cannot be prosecuted by Jack Smith, that Jack Smith doesn't have the authority to proceed the way he has. That could set up a circuit split. That could lead to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of crazy tentacles that kind of come out from the January 6th prosecution that could lead to further hearings and to further mischief in court. I think the state cases are in a little bit of a different posture. I mean, the Georgia case is kind of collapsing on its own weight because of the mismanagement by Fani Willis, the conflict of interest. The judge in that case had a hearing and determined that there was, in fact, a conflict of interest or an appearance of a conflict of interest, and took kind of a Solomonic approach and said, you have to get rid of either yourself or your paramour, Nathan Wade. I'm not sure the Court of Appeals is going to go with that. I think they're likely to say that she is, in fact, disqualified. And there's case law in Georgia that says if she's disqualified, her entire office is. So a lot of different hurdles here, legal issues to come forth. But that could end up being dismissed on its own weight eventually. And the New York case, we'll know November 25th. I think it's the 25th or 26th, actually.
That's the hush money case, yep.
That's the hush money case, remembering that hush money is not illegal. And I think that case, when it gets through the appellate process, has a myriad of problems for upholding a conviction. So we'll see where that goes. I don't think that's a particularly serious threat to him in the long run, though.
And is it right to think that if he loses, if he's not the next president of the United States, that the legal threats to him are greater?
For sure. It really becomes a fundamental political question. And, I've always thought this is really more of a political answer than a legal one, but I've always thought that if a Democrat, originally Biden and now Harris, were to win, maybe the smartest thing they could ever do is simply announce that they're pardoning Trump and they're pardoning the Biden family, and let's move on as a country and stop focusing on the past. I think there's certainly a huge element of the Democratic Party that would be up in arms. But as a country, I think it would be great if we could move beyond these political prosecutions of either Biden's or Trump's. But absent that kind of statesman-like moment, then those cases will proceed most likely, and we'll see, again, continued litigation, motions, appeals, pretrial appeals. And so none of it will likely be resolved within a couple of years, except for the New York criminal case.
How significant is the Supreme Court ruling granting a president immunity from criminal prosecution for acts carried out in their official capacity as president? I mean, some have interpreted this as a carte blanche to do as the president pleases, but that's not quite true, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, that's kind of a political scare tactic to say, the king can do no wrong. He's now allowed to murder people with impunity. Not true at all. It's really establishing something that I think is similar to the idea of immunity for law enforcement, that if they're acting somewhat within the outer reaches of their authority, then it's okay. But if they do something that's strictly personal, it's not. I don't think that's a crazy standard. But the devil's in the details. Litigating that, trying to figure out which things fall into professional versus personal is really challenging, and we've never seen it before. So we're waiting to see if Judge Chutkan in D.C. tries to set up a hearing on the January 6th matter to wade through that issue, which things are immunized, which things are not. And the last thing I'd say on that is the problem is if she determines something is immunized that Jack Smith felt differently about as a prosecutor, the indictment is contaminated, and he has to go back and go to the grand jury for a third time to present his case. So there's some real snafus that are on the horizon if the judge doesn't go along completely 100% with Jack Smith.
So the January the 6th case, which is, I think, for many non-Americans, the easiest one to understand, is a kind of accusing him of basically trying to overthrow the government or stop the choice of a new president. That seems the simplest one from the outside, but it's not clear-cut. It seems fraught with difficulties and legal procedures and complications.
Yeah, I mean, from knowing this from the inside, I can tell you that one of the common denominators that's very troublesome if you have been around criminal justice like I have for 35 years is singular treatment. And what we saw with President Trump on these indictments, that in the Mar-a-Lago case, attorney-client privilege was destroyed, which is a pretty rare moment. That led to an indictment that was very heavy on the communications between he and his attorney, Evan Corcoran. In January 6th, it's the same thing. Executive privilege, for the first time that we can think of, was destroyed. President Biden announced it doesn't apply to his predecessor. And so then you see an indictment that's heavy with what would normally be executive privilege material. That still has a lot of litigation to come in terms of pretrial appellate, or what they call interlocutory appeals. The sufficiency of it, remember, it's not insurrection in terms of actually charging it. It's charging uniquely conspiracy to defraud the United States by a man who apparently undeniably said, go peacefully and go patriotically, as part of his public face that day. So there's a lot of discovery issues, legal issues, things that could tie that case up for years. But with a Democratic president, presumably it would still chug forward.
The president has the power to issue pardons. That's in the Constitution. Can he pardon himself?
Yeah, that's a great question. We may find out. I mean, look, the safer route, or kind of the easier route, is if he has the Senate, which is kind of a key background issue here about how much he's going to be able to put his people into place if he wins. Then he could probably just fire Jack Smith through the attorney general and be happy that two of those cases are gone. Of course, he can't pardon himself for a state case under any scenario, yes. But a lot of legal scholars think that he can pardon himself for federal, that there's some kind of, again, new territory. But the suggestion is that by the way it's worded regarding impeachment, that it does imply that he has the authority to pardon himself. So that'll be a heck of a moment if it happens. I don't know if it'll be festive or if it'll be quietly done, but I don't think there's much option that it wouldn't be a very high-profile moment. Probably if the House flips over to the Democrats, it turns into an article of impeachment. So we're back to what we lived with for 4 years with constant impeachment.
If he did fire Jack Smith, do the Smith cases, which is in the classified documents, and January the 6th, these are the two cases that Smith's been involved in, do they just go away then?
Well, in a sense, but you're right to flag the issue, because under the federal rules of criminal procedure, a court only dismisses a case upon a finding of good cause. It doesn't mean that I've ever seen a situation where the court refused to dismiss a case. In other words, Jack gets off the case, the Department of Justice under President Trump's control announces they're not going forward anymore. There is some room for a district court judge to kind of play games there and say, well, I'm not sure I'm going to dismiss the case. Of course, if you're the Department of Justice, you say, well, do what you want, but we're not staffing it, which is really kind of an incredible showdown where I think the judge would have to blink eventually. So we're not, again, new territory. Nobody can tell you that they have certainty here. But realistically, if he fires Jack Smith and has an attorney general in place, those cases will die on the vine. And his appeal, the DOJ appeal of Judge Cannon's ruling in Florida, would probably be abandoned, which would safeguard the dismissal in the Florida case.
And finally, Jim, if Trump wins, he'll leave an even bigger imprint on the federal judiciary, won't he? And not just at the Supreme Court level, at many lower courts, federal courts, he makes lots of appointments.
Yeah, the trend really going back to Bill Clinton, I think, has been to make appointments of people that are young. It leaves yours truly out of the mix. But there's a lot of folks that, that view this as kind of lifetime appointments on a practical sense, both to the district courts, the Court of Appeals, and as well to the Supreme Court. So you see a general trending of going younger. And I will say that no matter what the problems were between President Trump and Mitch McConnell, McConnell focused heavily last time on moving those appointments along and had great success numerically compared to how the Democrats typically have done. So I do think that's another area where the district courts, courts of appeals, and possibly the Supreme Court, couple of names that make sense for potential retirements, are in the crosshairs of this election. Obviously, these candidates are radically different in terms of their approach to law and order, and you'll see a very different series of court appointments by whichever one wins.
A lot hanging on it for this election, for the judicial system as well. Jim Trusty, thanks for going through that with us. It's good to have you on Times Radio.
Sure. Thanks for having me.